Hello, everyone. Welcome to this. We start the session now, so welcome to the third webinar of this webinar series organized by the Gren Jobs Assessment Institutions Network. I hope you can hear me properly. Otherwise, please use the chat box. So my name is Adria. I'm part of the GAIN team and also the Gren Jobs program here at the ILO, and I'm delighted today to facilitate this session as I have been facilitating other sessions. Now, before we start, I would just like to inform you that you may send your questions at any time during the session using the chat. We will collect these questions, and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, in order to write these questions, you need first to activate the chat by clicking on the chat box figure that you will find at the bottom of the screen. And then the chat will open at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And now, as you know and might be familiar with, the topic for today's session is the development and eventual ownership of Gren Jobs Assessment Models. This is framed within the broader context of the need to provide with evidence-based, policy-oriented research that can lead to the just transition to a green economy. So now, going over our agenda for today, we will first provide an introduction of how does the GAIN network support the development and eventual country ownership of this GJAM or Gren Jobs Assessment Models. And the introduction will briefly present the main concepts and the methodology proposed. Then we will move on to the first presentation of the two Gren Jobs Assessment reports that we're presenting today, which is a country-specific Gren Jobs study of Tunisia. It has been elaborated by the German-based Institute of Economic Structures Research and the Tunisian research outfits Alcor and Ecocer. Thereafter, we will present the country-specific Gren Jobs study of India, elaborated by the National Council of Applied Economic Research, based in India, and also supported by the GAIN network. So not only will this presentation help to gain knowledge on the Gren Jobs state in India, but also by contrasting this with the previous presentation, it will showcase how the methodology was used in a similar but also different way. This intends to highlight how the methodology can accommodate different needs and approaches. And finally, after these presentations, we'll have time for a Q&A session in which you're very welcome to ask questions to our speakers. Now, our speakers for today are, first of all, Massimiliano Lamarca. Massi is Senior Economist at the Multilateral Cooperation Department of the International Labour Organization. Massi holds a PhD in Economics from the New School for Social Research in New York and a PhD in Economics from the University of Pavia in Italy. Then we'll have Ulrike Lehr, who will present. She is Senior Expert at the Institute of Economic Structures Research and has been working there since 2008. She holds a PhD from the University of Hohenheim and a Master's in Physics from the University of Essen and in Economics from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University from the US. And finally, we have Anushree, who is Senior Fellow at the National Council of Applied Economic Research, which she joined in 1989 and since then has held several positions. Anushree is a postdoctorate from the Department of International Development, University of Oxford, and has been a Fulbright lecturing professor at Rutgers during 2013-2014. So this being said, thank you very much for your attendance and participation. And let's just kick off the session by giving the floor to Massi to start with the first presentation. So all yours, Massi. Thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy the session. All yours.
Thank you very much, Adria, and welcome to you all. I'm going to see our first slides. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of the Gren Jobs Assessment Model as a way of integrating the economic, social, environmental dimension in making policy assessments. So first of all, also just a reminder of what is a GAIN network. The GAIN network was established in 2013. It is mostly a community of practice of experts that share basic conceptual framework in assessing the impacts of policy, especially on jobs. There are at the moment 33 members that combine the research institute, individual researcher, international organizations, and the ultimate objective is to support building capacity in research analysis at the country level, to produce evidence-based policy that support policy making especially for sustainable development strategies. Now, well, the GAIN network produced a guidebook the guidebook, it's a building block, let's say, of our approach, in a sense that it lays out the conceptual framework and methodologies on methodology and also on the source and use of data. For example, what is the concept of the green jobs and how it relates to sustainable development policies, the methodology of building input-output social accounting matrices, how to use them, and it represents how the share framework of the GAIN network, as I mentioned, which as an ultimate objective then to allow country researchers to build their own national assessment model for policies. Now, just this to remind us that we are living in a new framework also where the concept of sustainability embraces three dimensions, which is the economic, social, environmental dimension. Um, Therefore, our policy assessment should be touching upon all these aspects. Now, a building block is the system of national accounts that is a framework for building data at the national level, macroeconomic data and sectoral data. And the national accounts are building blocks in any analysis as they provide the definition of also economic variables. For these economic variables to be internally consistent with each other and also to be consistent with the data available and produced by the National Statistical Office. Now, the system of national accounts focus on monetary transaction between actors in institutional sectors. The typically dimensions are those in this slide, and the way the economic system is represented is a flow of transaction between sectors, and it focuses on monetary transactions. What they are mostly economic and some social aspects are represented, but this is not enough. We need to integrate it in this system of national accounts, the use of it, with also using another system of accounting, which is the environmental economic accounting. Now, these frameworks allow to measure the contribution of the environment to the economy and the impact of the economy on the environment, and is fully consistent with a system of national accounts. That's a way to represent the interaction between the economy, and this gray shaded circle represent um, the economic system with the monetary transaction between the economic sectors. And you see the interaction with the environment is by drawing national inputs and then producing residuals in the forms of emissions. Now, within the sphere of the economic system as such, there are also transactions like consumption and production of goods and services, which can be defined environmental. I will this environmental aspect of the good and service is reflected by the way that they produce residuals and emissions and the way they use natural inputs. This leads us to the concept of what is environmental sector, or EGS, environmental goods and service sector, which is a component of a system of environmental and economic account, and are those activities whose primary purpose is to reduce or eliminate the pressure on the environment, and these are the environmental protection activities, or to make more efficient use of natural resources, and these are resource management activities. And these allows us to define somehow green jobs, which are jobs in the environmental sector. The environmental dimension is defined with reference to the SEA, exactly what I mentioned about the activities, but they also have a decent work component, which is measured according to relevant indicators selected from ILO guidelines. And the indicators for decent work are, these are just the core indicators. So the decent work concept is a multidimensional concept, and of course, every analysis should be tailored to the objective, to the country need, to the country realities, and so we need to also identify which aspect of decent work is relevant for that analysis, and we can link these dimensions, some of these dimensions of decent work, to the analysis through the GGAMs, and I will show you how. The input-output framework can bring together all these elements, the national account aspects, the environmental and economic accounting aspects, and the decent work dimension. How? As will be explained more in detail later, the input-output allows for a disaggregation of production by industries, and these industries can be based on activities which are green and non-green. Then it allows a breakdown in products that can also be defined as environmental or not. In the value-added part, we can also have a breakdown of contribution labor inputs of jobs that can be also associated to certain decent work dimension. So we can have an analysis of the economic aspects, of the environmental aspects, and also of the quality of work. And this very much depends on the choice of the modeler, of the analyst, to have certain relevant breakdowns. Now, just introduced to the concept, this is the input-output table. A social accounting matrix is an extension of the input-output table with breakdowns of the households and more information on the flows of income from and to institutional sectors like households, enterprises, and the rest of the world. Now, what are going to the modeling once you have the data framework, then what are the relevant modeling frameworks that you can use? The multiplier analysis is based on input-output social accounting matrices, is based on some assumptions on the structure and the behavior of the economy, and has some advantages that are very easy to use and to interpret, and has some advantages also in the capacity to provide fundamental information on the structure of the economy. And as any modeling system has some limitations, there are other modeling frameworks like a structural multisectoral simulation models, which is a term just to can be used for including linear and nonlinear models with some different behavioral assumptions on production and consumptions. And there is a computational general equilibrium models, which are also uh, nonlinear model based on input, output, and social accounting matrices, and they have some typically some assumption on the adjustment mechanism of the markets, and the system dynamics approach when is the approach is complementing a multi-sector analysis that allow for an integration of multi-sectoral analysis at industry level and disaggregation of labor with more interaction with some other economic environmental dimensions. So these are the basic frameworks existing. Now, there are some desirable properties of models, and first of all, they have to include all these three dimensions, but they have a fundamental aspect is to have some realistic features on the labor market, in a sense that eventually the labor market is affecting what is the outcome also in production. So they need to allow for some form of unemployment or underemployment, and this underemployment can be in the form of underemployment in the formal and informal sector. So there are some choice and options, but it's important to allow for a job creation and job destruction, and also allow for a non-zero-sum effect on policies that allows us also to assess whether these policies are net job producing or not. Social outcomes are important also to see how job creation and certain job creation have feedbacks on demand and production. And finally, models should be country specific. They should be in a sense that each country has some structural characteristics, and even the adjustment of the markets can be different from one to the another, and should be tailored to the characteristic of the countries. So there is no universal blueprint, and this is important because policy needs to capture all the aspects of the economy. Now, this is just to show some effects, some multipliers from a matrix from Zambia, from an input-output matrix of Zambia. Now, this graphs just showing some results of analysis saying what is the effect of an increase in final demand on employment. You see this aggregation of industries. That's coming from an input-output table. It can come something similar like this from another more complicated model and structural model. It is in the same way, models with the disaggregation of households can also give information on the effect on households consumption by quintile, and so they can add to the social dimension. Just to make some examples, now, to summarize, the GJAM, the Green Jobs Assessment models, this should be based on the integrated national data with indicators coming from statistical standards, which is the System of National Accounts from the UN, the System of Environmental Economic Accounts, and other standards from ILO. There should be flexibility in focusing the national needs in the disaggregation. There can be a formal, informal sector disaggregation, formal, informal employment disaggregation, green, non-green. Labor can be disaggregated by occupation, employment status, and other forms. It's important to have some modularity in the sense that we can create a model based on methodologies which are well established, but there is no blueprint, as I mentioned. And then finally, the capacity building for nationally build an own model, in the sense that ultimately it should be transmitted to the countries or to the research of the country for them to make their own assessments. And with this, I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Masi, for this introduction. I believe this is a perfect introduction to what will now be illustrated by Ulrike and Anusri. So with this, we can see clearly the underpinnings of the methodology proposed by these GJAMs. And so with this, and as mentioned before, now we'll see in greater detail how that can be applied to country-specific Green Jobs assessments in the form of studies or reports. So this being said, let's move on to Ulrike's presentations. So all yours, Ulrike.
Thank you, Adria, and thank you, Masi, for the kind introduction. I do need the ownership of my screen.
Yeah, 1 second.
Not yet. If we do have a problem here, I can also always say next.
Yeah, just 1 second, please. One second. Now.
Creating a moment of suspense.
Yes, maybe in the meantime, just to mention that if you have any questions, please, you can start typing into the chat, and we'll start working on it. I'm waiting for Fatma. Are you here?
Yes.
Can you please move the ownership of the presenter's ownership to Ulrika?
Yeah.
Excellent. Technology is facilitating our life. I would like to take you through the results and also the methodology of a study we have been doing in the framework of the Gren Jobs Assessment. And the country we have been analyzing is Tunisia. The report looks like this, and my special thanks go to my in-house colleague Anke Mönning and to Rafik Misawi and Sami Marouki. As Adria has already mentioned, they are from the companies Alcor and Ecoser in Tunisia, and without having access to national data, the study would have been impossible. So in the next couple of minutes, I will be taking you through the project, the method, the data, the results, and come up with some conclusions. Why would we measure green jobs in the framework of the Gren Jobs Assessment? This is, as Masi already told you, about the degradation of the environment, so the environmental challenge, the pollution of water, soil and air, the loss of biodiversity, and the global threats to sustainability, basically. All these things are aggravated by the impact of climate change. And this being only a couple of days away from the next conference of the party in Katowice, we should all keep climate change in our mind and cross our fingers that there will be some good results from the next conference of the party. On the social level, the challenges are unemployment, in particular among young people. And of course, as Masi showed, all the other indicators, inclusion, participation in a better, healthier, and safer life. Thus, green employment is an important indicator of this successful transition to a green economy. It gives the policymaker, the decision maker, the stakeholders, and society, civil society, an indicator of how far have we already gone on this way of transition and what is, let's say, what's left to go. In Tunisia, we are trying to contribute to these targets in two different ways. On the one hand, we try to carry forward the methodology. And secondly, obviously, we are doing a quantitative analysis and coming up with results. We are looking along two timelines. We are looking to the past in our ex post evaluation, trying to calculate what already has been achieved. And then we are looking to the future in a small simulation model that tells us what might be achievable under different scenarios. Briefly on the method, this is the person who started all this, and he was rewarded the Nobel Prize with it. This is a picture of Vasily Leontiev, an American economist. So how can we measure green jobs? To estimate existing green jobs today, we first of all have to identify what is a green job. In which economic sector does the people who's holding a green job work? And Masi gave us some indicators and pointed us to the classification of environmental goods and services. And we're trying to translate this classification to the sector structure of the economy in the respective country under scrutiny. Then we are calculating green employment in each sector, which is we calculate the number of direct green jobs. And the next step, we employ the input-output logic to estimate indirect green jobs. So we are constructing an input-output table, or we are taking an existing input-output table and then adding green sectors. So the final input-output table will distinguish between green and non-green activities. Obviously, it has to maintain consistency with the original input-output table. And then we are able to employ the new input-output table to the original employment vector and get our green jobs. This whole thing, the first step in particular, is called the identification problem. In the second part of this slide, then we are going to the future and trying to solve the forecasting problem, which means we have to create a simulation model based on time series of input-output tables, if available, and some macroeconomic drivers such as population and GDP. The input-output table, Masi already showed you some examples. I just take you through the basic structure briefly. The columns show the cost structure. So they answer the question, what is necessary to be able to produce final production? And the rows show which sector delivers to the other sectors what, and what does it also deliver to final demand. If we want to expand now, if you want to create a green and non-green part input-output table, we have to look at each and every cell and split the rows and the columns into the green and the non-green part. And I brought you the example for agriculture here in this slide. Remember on the slide before, there was some agriculture delivering to agriculture 10 units. That is covering seeds, livestock, feedstock, and things like this. Now in our new table, we are distinguishing between conventional agriculture and organic agriculture. But obviously we want to maintain the original structure, so the sum has to be as before. And the diagonal elements of this little box that is marked in red are green to green and non-green to non-green. So afterwards, in this example, we set or get it from data or get it from interviews and so on, that conventional agriculture gets 8 units from conventional agriculture and organic gets 2 units from organic agriculture. But we know more about it. We know more about the entries in these little boxes. So we have to make 4 cells out of 1 cell. But we obviously can use a lot of information that is out there. In the organic agriculture example, we know that organic agriculture may not use non-organic fertilizer by, being certified and all these things. Therefore, inputs have to shift from the chemical industry, which produces the non-organic fertilizer, to, for instance, organic agriculture, which produces the organic fertilizers. And that has to be reflected in the input structure, and the example then shows not only a shift between organic and conventional, but also a shift between manufacturing and organic agriculture. And if you take the time to go through the slides later on, you will be able to see that. But we do not always know what to put in these 4 little boxes. And therefore, in our project, we developed the construction rules for the cases, basically when we don't know things. Rule number 1 is inputs to green sectors are green. Rule number 2, the input structure of green subsectors is the same as for their non-green counterparts. Wait a second, you're going to say. You just explained us quite lengthily that we have to change the input structure for organic agriculture. That's why we came up with rule number 3. Exceptions to rule number 2 have to be separately identified, as in this example of organic farming. So if we do know more, rule number 2 is overruled. But if we do not have any information, we may use rule number 2. This is an overview of the Tunisian input-output table, already a bit aggregated between sectors that can be greened and sectors that cannot be taken apart and greened. So we have been defining, rather in the middle, something that is a non-green or brown sector, which includes tobacco and most mining activities. All the other sectors, agriculture, food industry, greenable industries, have been split. In the case of water, it is a fully green sector, so there's no conventional part. Electricity then is split again into renewables and fossil fuel based, and services are also split. Typically, if it comes to jobs, green sectors are slightly more labor intensive, but only slightly, as you see from the slide. Agriculture shows the largest difference. All the other sectors are very, very similar in terms of labor intensity. To project it into the future, we have been estimating the 10 largest input-output coefficients from a time series of input-output tables. We have been estimating labor productivity from Tunisian data, and we have been, or our Tunisian colleagues have been collecting information on investment scenarios and future investment paths under different greening scenarios. Then you have to implement these scenarios into the tool and calculate employment. As simple as that. What are the results from this? Looking to the past, we find, and you do not have to go through all these numbers. This is more for maybe after this presentation. Looking to the past, we find 110,000 people roughly work in green job activities in Tunisia. Most of them in agriculture, in electricity and gas, and in water and waste. And as I said, the water and also the waste sector are considered to be fully green. Are these jobs decent jobs? There were stakeholder discussions on two different events. I brought you the example of the waste management, and we also had another stakeholder meeting on the issues of energy and I think and agriculture. Yeah, but in waste collection, for instance, all stakeholders were of the opinion, no, in waste collection the jobs are decent jobs. There's no child labor. There's almost no informal activities apart from maybe right after the revolution. And the jobs in the context of micro enterprises in the development of recycling are also considered to be decent jobs. If we want to talk about the future, we need a baseline to compare something, to compare a greener scenario to something and actually see what is the difference, what is the benefit, or what is better or worse than in a baseline scenario, which basically does not do anything about the green economy. Here you see total employment and green employment in this slide. Unfortunately, I have to apologize. Conventional employment is in the color of green and green employment is in the color of blue. Sorry for that. Now it's better. Now the green employment is really green. In the first scenario we considered, we are looking at energy efficiency and renewable energy, and we find 12,000 people, 14,000 even in the years 2021 or 2023, more than in the baseline scenario. This is how you read these slides. You look at the green bars, and that is always giving you the difference to the baseline scenario. In the waste sector, we looked at the waste sector in scenario number 2. There, 3 centers for storing and transferring special and industrial waste will be built. Landfill infrastructure will be improved, and the treatment of hazardous and industrial waste will also be improved. And you see the additional employment follows the investment path. So when the landfill infrastructure is improved, in these years you have higher employment of up to 8,000 people. Oh, by the way, the Tunisian labor market is around 5 million people, just to give you a rough idea what these numbers relate to. Scenario number 3 looks at water, and that comes with large investment, and immediately you see there is a lot of green jobs being created under this scenario. up to 30,000 people. And scenario number 4 has the largest impact. That's the transformation of certain parts of agriculture to organic agriculture, and it leads to 40,000 people. All together, at the peak times, we have 80,000 jobs, green jobs, more under all these scenarios together. And these scenarios were not very, very challenging or ultimately ambitious. They are doable. To finish and come to conclusions, the simulation model and approach was explorative, to say the least. We have tried to deal with data availability issues, which have been very difficult to get people to think about the green part of certain industries. But the first results are very promising. To simulate complete strategies with all the monetary incentives, this approach needs to be complemented by another or a further going framework that includes prices and reactions to price changes, as Massi has pointed out on his slides of the different modeling tools. But we do think this methodology gives a very good overview of first and second round effects. And it gives you something at hand also because negative and positive effects can be simulated. So you can actually go to the decision maker and say, listen, we have analyzed scenarios under which 80,000 people will have additional employment in Tunisia. So greening leads actually to net positive effects. And then I think you get much more attention compared to a situation where you just say, oh, I heard about greening and maybe it needs to some positive effects, but I don't know how much. So the 80,000 people, I think, really gets the attention of the decision makers. If you're interested in the report, you can download it under the link that is given in the bottom of this slide. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and pass the word on to Anushree.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. Yes, as Ulrika mentioned, all yours, Anushree.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to all, according to where you are now. Thank you, Adria and Gren, for this opportunity to present NCAER study on assessing green job potential in India, sponsored by the ILO. Just wanted to add that Adria has already detailed the green job models, and we are working within that framework. And there's a need to move towards augmented systems of national accounts by introducing environmentally sustainable sectors within that framework of the United Nations 2008 SNA. And luckily, Ulrich spoke a lot about understanding the input structure, how important it is to understand that in entirety whether the sector is green or not. This issue will come on my presentation as well, and about the types of jobs that are created in the green sectors. Given this background, India is also committed to the sustainable development goals and to naturally environmentally friendly production processes. In light of this, the green sector study was undertaken, and these green sectors are key to sustainable growth path. Creating jobs for Indian youths is an important agenda, and the Indian government acknowledges that. Through this study, we assess the potential and quality of jobs created through investment in green sectors. And such studies actually inform policies. And we had done some policy briefs within this study network on this particular study as well. So the objective of the study was to develop, as already mentioned by the previous speakers, a green job model, and for this it was a green job input-output model that could use multipliers to estimate sectoral job creation. And such a model is therefore capable in determining the employment and growth effects of any kind of investment or rise in demand that comes through by endorsing green sectors, which should be a strategy for any government as of today, and it's also a strategy for the Indian government. For developing such a model, it was a challenging task, and it was quite a big study sponsored by the ILO. And we had used both secondary and primary data sources. The secondary data sources are the usual types. For example, the input-output table at that time, which we could get, was a 2007-8 input-output table that was developed by the the CSO, which is the Statistical Organization for India, Central Statistical Organization for India. This was updated to a more later year for which we could get more data. That was for 2009-10, and the updatation was done through the usual methods, and I could discuss this in case of need in QA session. The unemployment and employment survey was conducted in 2009-10, therefore it matched and mapped accordingly to the 2009-10 IO table. And through that, we could get the estimates of employment shares by each of the sectors that we had to develop for this input-output model, green model. And the primary data collection was a very exciting part of this study because there were some new sectors that we had to come out with, and Massey actually talked about disaggregating input-output sectors to get to our own desired sectors. And for doing that, it was sometimes necessary to get different coefficients, and because the technical coefficients that we could get from the all India level input-output table actually could not match to these very micro sectors that we needed for this particular study. And therefore, we had conducted this primary survey. This primary survey was in consultation with the ILO. We had developed this for, we had conducted study in only nine states, not entire all the states, but this was representative because we used the states that had more of this renewable, green sectors, so that it was representative. The questions were asked from different types and different levels of government officials and other stakeholders, including the wind energy developers or the forest rangers and enterprises that were involved in green sector activities. So we had variety of or various modules of these questions, and we had conducted this survey to get to specifics on coefficients and for using it in the input-output table. Through this, it was an interesting study, and through a hybrid method, we developed this green input-output model for India. How we did that was we aggregated, first of all, the input-output table that was available for 130 sectors to 16 sectors. And then we disaggregated this, another 4 sectors, to get a total of 20 sectors. Out of this, we had to disaggregate, as I said already, to get to the micro level green sectors that were of interest to our study. Then the models that we developed were of 2 types. That was through an open model and a closed model, and I'll come to that later. But open model is a standard input-output model. Closed model goes a little bit further, nearing to the social accounting metrics kind of a framework, because it includes households within that endogenous part of the input-output table. And through that, therefore, we could derive direct, indirect, and induced multipliers that came out of this closed models, the induced multipliers. Next is, so the sectors in focus, where, as I said, 4 new sectors, but then we had in totality 7 sectors of focus. This was because, let's say, what are these sectors? Forestry and logging, which is a standard conventional sector within any input-output table. We had this sector as it is in the input-output table itself from the CSO. We had to develop the watershed development sector specifically for this study. Wind energy was not a sector separated in the IO table, so we had to separate it out, and this was done and contrasted with the other electricity sector, which was all other electricity apart from, of course, wind energy. So we could compare the conventional energy sectors and the wind energy sector. Wind turbine generator as a very important input, as input structures are important, already discussed, for the green sectors. This is the prime input for the wind energy sector. Manufacturing as such also taken, because it's a very important sector within the huge sector within the economy, and many inputs are coming from that to various other industries that we're talking about. Metro transport services was a very small sector, because at that time only Delhi Metro had actually come through, and a bit of the Madras Metro was also starting, but we really did not have too much of these metro services in India. And also the Delhi Metro was quite contained at that period of time, but we still did the metro transport services versus the rail transport. Information gave us an idea of the intensity of employment that could be generated in conventional and non-conventional transport service sectors. Just to have an idea of the kind of sectors and their weights in employment as a basic level. And here we can immediately see that in the entire sectors that we had developed for this study, agriculture naturally took the entire, more than 50% of the employment was generated in agriculture in India. This is, of course, calculated using the NSSO data to the unemployment, as I talked to you about it earlier. As we see that the other sectors, specifically the sectors of interest to us, have very low weight in employment when we started this study. So the weights of these sectors are very low, because even their outputs are low compared to the total output, and their employment generations or the employment itself per se were very low. So therefore there is this issue about weighing the entire input-output table into some sectors which should be. So there is a question that we might want to go through again or revisit to improve such a modeling where sectors are given more uniform weightage in terms of both output and employment. As you see that all other sectors are actually 44%, and the remaining, the lowest in this, nearly two of these are wind energy and metro services, both of which have very low weights in employment to start with. So as I said already, we had done this distribution and types of workers by using the NSSO 66 round, as we know, 2009-10, and use those shares to generate employment by types and gender for these 20 sectors that were developed for this input-output model. And the types are actually two types: formal workers, who we regarded formal were those who said that we are regular workers, and the informal workers were those which were employed in unregistered sectors. Straightforward, I mean, they are all informal workers, but also casual workers who were in registered firms were considered as informal, and all unpaid helpers and own account workers. These are standard as of now in India by many other studies that have taken into account how to define informal workers in India. Sorry, oh, 1 minute, gone wrong. So then if we have this distribution of types of workers and by gender, then we can just see at the base level for 2009-10 what was the distribution of these various types and gender of the workers. And we see that a very large proportion of workers were actually informal male workers in India, which is 67% nearly. And the remaining women workers, a very small percentage of them were actually in the formal part. And women workers in totality is only about 26%, of which nearly 24% are informal female workers. So that itself also puts a lot of concern about the participation of women in the labor force and their where they are in the entire process of value chain in the levels of employment. If we look at the various sectors that we have considered and look at their employment coefficients and the open and closed total employment multipliers, we see that the closed employment multipliers that has come out of our closed model, as I already said, where consumption or households are included in the model itself, and therefore taken the entire national accounts system into account. For example, the production generating employment and employment generating demand for goods and demand for goods, again generating production processes. We take the entire ambit of it, we see that the close of employment multiplier at the highest in all these sectors. And you compare amongst these sectors, the closed models, we see that watershed development and metro transport services are actually doing very good in terms of closed employment multipliers. In terms of just the open employment multiplier, we again see that watershed development and metro transport are doing good, but then rail transport and even wind turbines are okay, not so bad in terms of their open employment multipliers. Employment coefficients we've already looked at earlier, but this shows again that they are very low in the focus sectors. So what are the focus employment outcomes among the study sectors? As I already said, watershed development sectors, as expected, because the high intensity of labor, they have the highest open and total closed employment multipliers, and they're very labor intensive sector, and most of the labor is, however, informal. In contrast, I think, to what Ulrich said, for example, in waste management, if we look in Tunisia, we find that most of the workers could be formal, but if we look at such a sector in India, I think nearly 99% of those workers would be informal in India because of the conditions of work and the safety of work. So again, if we look at the energy sector, we see that the employment multipliers, both open and closed, for this sector slightly lower than the conventional electricity sector. So there's not a huge difference in their intensity of multipliers. Wind energy generation employs less labor per unit, as we already saw, and the other electricity generation, of course, employs more. The indirect effect is higher in wind energy, which is an interesting thing as opposed to conventional. Comparing open and closed employment multipliers, therefore, if you see in the what is interesting, therefore, here is that wind energy, the additional workers that can come out of 1 unit of generation of wind energy is actually higher than other electricity, though the actual level of employment is higher in other electricity. So that's the multiplier effect of wind energy sector is rather high. And again, if we see that, what we find is that closed multipliers, of course, are always higher, and still what is coming out of the type of workers is informality that reigns in this entire creation of employment. So what we saw from the earlier slide, we see that wind energy generation employs less labor per unit of production than other electricity, but indirect effect of wind energy sector is higher, which is interesting, and it shows that the intensity or the potential of developing wind energy sector and the potential of growth of employment is good if you really go for renewable energy production in a country like India. In net, therefore, however, as of now, the wind energy sector, given the level of employment that it has now, is so small, it employs comparatively less labor than conventional energy sector, but this could be flipped if we go more directly into huge investment in the wind energy sector. Lower employment intensity in the wind energy sector is due to the low level, as I said, of the direct employment generation, and therefore we can sort of do this through policy interventions, improve the employment of the wind energy sector by increasing investment in this sector. Already, I think, I've spoken about this, but again, this shows that the metro transport services are doing better in terms of multiplier effects, though in terms of direct employment or employment coefficients, they are lower. In terms of employment generation, metro actually is higher than conventional railway transport services. Again, if we look at the formal and informal employment aspects, we see that among the study sectors, the share of direct employment generation in total impact for formal workers is highest in metro, because metro services generally employ more skilled people, engineers, and more such people who are capable or are endowed with skills that could lead them to have decent work. So this is a sector that could generate more formal work. But at the same time, railways, however, has much lower share of formal employment, and number of workers within the railway conventional sector are informal or are working in not so decent work environment and very low wages, etc. Most of the employment generated in railways in the formal sector is therefore not due to this direct and indirect effects, but due to the induced income effect. Therefore, it's completely coming through the entire economy, reacting to various shocks due to investment in the railway sector, and the other sectors come into play to give this net result of higher employment generation in this particular sector. If you look at the shares of direct, indirect, and induced employment, as we already have gone through this, induced impact is higher. And again, the highest are in the wind energy sector, which is interesting. As I already said, this as an induced effect is high, and metro transport sector also is high. If you look at the direct, indirect, and induced impact by gender, then again we see that it is the watershed development. For male workers, it is watershed development. No, sorry, it is again wind energy sector, and then above 90 you see is railway transport and wind energy sectors and wind turbine as well, which we'll have to discuss whether it's a green sector or not. But these are the sectors that are developing more male workers. And for women workers, we find that they are again involved in wind energy, wind turbine as a manufacturing sector, and other electricity and wind energy as well. In terms of shares, if you just look at the shares, you see that this is the shares, but we look at the entire ambit of total female workers, we saw that the entire game is played within 26% of the employment generated in India. So they're a very low level of playing by the women workers in this atmosphere. Have it gone up? Sorry, going down. So if we look at the gender outcomes from this study, we find that the agriculture sector has been able to generate more direct employment for women. The percentage share of direct impact as part of total impact is always the highest in agriculture, and it remains so for women as well. The other manufacturing sector has the highest indirect employment impact on female employment, followed again here by agriculture, quite second even in this. Share of indirect employment generated in the total close multiplier, that is total everything included, is highest for the aggregated other manufacturing sector, again for women, followed by other transport services sector, where we have women workers. If you see in terms of numbers, then the employment generation we did through simulations of 10% shock in demand of these various sectors, the focus sectors, and we find that in totality, there is about 1.25 million jobs created if you increase demand through investment in these various sectors, all in total. And out of that, more than 90% are actually informal workers, which is not a very good picture. Therefore, even if you're investing in green jobs, the outcome is not, in investing in green sectors, the outcome is not green jobs. And therefore, there needs to be interventions of different types to augment a situation where decent jobs are created out of green sectors. That's a necessity that we need to rub in to the government and policy making processes. Concluding their remarks, therefore, there are three types of impacts that we have seen are much higher for informal workers, all types, and compared to formal workers, except for direct employment generation in the public sector, administration, defense, and metro. So metro, as already said, that has more skilled people employed in this sector, and therefore they generate formal employment. The employment generated by induced income effect is much greater than in open model. The employment, so therefore it is what the need of the model, what it actually tries to say is that when you do a green sector model, there is a need to close these models for households as well. So you need to get the entire ambit of the interactions. Otherwise, you get a half picture of the impact. So it is important that you either do it through CG model or a social accounting matrix or a closed input-output model That would give you the entire picture of the impact of any kind of production increases on employment generation. The employment multipliers, again, for all sectors are greater for male workers. That despite recent developments in female workforce participation, none of these sectors or development and investment in any of these sectors, green and conventional, could generate more income, more employment for women workers, and more unfortunately, the work that have been generated are within the informal framework. Hence, there is a need that when you talk about green sectors, we need to distinguish that green sectors per se are not enough or capable to generate green jobs. So of course we had data limitations and there might be a better picture or maybe some variations if we do a bigger study in terms of changing the technical coefficients by advancing and doing more survey of the important sectors that are in focus. Also need to realize that all the input sectors that we consider green by definition, because they are included into or they are inputting into the green sectors, are not green per se. And specific example is the wind turbine manufacturing sector, which is the huge and the biggest input sector for wind energy, which is definitely a green sector. Wind energy is definitely a green sector, but wind turbine generation manufacturing is a question. And if you really want to see whether wind turbine generation manufacturing is green, we need to do a life cycle assessment to understand when it goes green. Need to collect data on employment. New data are to be collected on employment in new green sectors and support in transition to decent jobs, because this would be able to inform policymakers in the processes of investment that they are going to take forward for a more sustainable development goal focused agenda of growth in a country like India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adria, for this insightful presentation. Now, I believe I'm cognizant of the time that Masi has an important commitment, so maybe I will hand over to you, Masi, if you have any closing remarks, and after that, we'll just have a short time for 1 or 2 questions. So in the meantime, please ask your questions in the chat box. So I hand over to Masi if you have any closing remarks. Thank you.
Just, I think we can directly go to the question and answer and save time. So if there's any question, I will let you raise your hands and Adria will take care of it and then we can answer.
Okay, so with this we go to the question and answer. So please type your questions in the chat box and we'll address them now.
Adria, you want me to comment on the 2 questions I already received?
Yes, please. If you can expand on that, that would be great. Yes.
Okay. Can you mute your mic?
Yes.
Okay, I received 2 questions. One on the issue of mining, and I have to admit my slides were not very clear on that. The general intuition on the mining sector is always that mining is not a really greenable sector. However, in the stakeholder process in Tunisia, people pointed out that there have been in one part of the mining sector, and I'm not really sure if I remember it right, but there have been made large investments into the efficiency of mining and also into the rehabilitation of the landscape and so on. And since Masi showed that the definition is also including more efficient process in terms of use of resources, we decided to include that small part into mining. On the issue of waste management, of waste and decency of jobs, I'm happy to get the questions there because we have been discussing it a lot in Tunisia. A bit more information is on page 38 in the report. For you to take home, stakeholders have been very, very proud of the legislation they have in the mining sector and worker protection they have. And there is let's say, more protection and more legislation than in A, in other sectors, and B, in other countries. So waste management has been a focus of several Tunisian governments, and the regulation really was rather strict on a lot of the issues that are connected with the decency of jobs. That would be it from my side.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I would like to ask Anush if you could expand a bit on the effect of this induced effect, because it seems to be really important, and also depending on whether it affects on formal, informal, male and female. So maybe you could expand on that, given that it seems to be very relevant.
Yeah. Thank you, Adria. The induced effect is coming out of the closed model, right? So when I said it is similar to the national accounting system framework, it actually, within the input-output endogenous part, where you have sectors, you also put households as one sector. So when you put households as one sector, you are putting it across in the row as well as the column. So what the household is generating, it is generating value, it is getting value added, it's generating demand for goods. So closing the model. So you have in both the value added generation is going to the household, so it's receiving value added from various sectors, right? And it's actually expanding also by through its consumption on various sectors. So that's the way it's closing the model. So once you are giving a shock to any sector, what happens now is household is not remaining outside of the endogenous part of the input-output table. It is actually household is remaining within the endogenous part. It is not in the final demand exogenous part of the input-output. So when you give a shock by through an investment, demand raise, arise in any of the sectors, what would happen is immediately the input-output model multipliers will throw out the impact due to this inclusion of households within the framework. I don't know if I'm making it clear. So what's happening is if there is a production, there will be employment generated that will come through within the model. The employment generated and the value addition by these households that they receive the income, they will again expand on the various consumption items. And because of the consumption demand that rises within the framework, that will impact production, which will again lead to growth in employment. So the growth in employment is not only due to direct and indirect impact, but also because of the induced impact that is coming through income and related consumption because of that increased income. So that's the closed story. Now, in terms of formal and informal employment, when we look at the formal and informal employment, we're looking at various types of work. So we say within a household, there are different types of workers. Now, workers are actually situated within households. So we know that from the sector, it goes to the workers. Now, the workers are formal workers or informal workers, and they are also women or men. Then this, through the employment and unemployment, we know that this type of household, I mean, if this household has how many formal workers, how many informal workers. So we know a structure of the household. So using the NSSO information of the structure of the household, we can we can have a composite household that has both informal and formal workers working in that household. And they will have different incomes that may also, as a consolidated, will go in the value addition. So we'll have a consolidated income, of course. We'll not see by member what is the consumption. It will be the consolidated income that will induce consumption. But we know how many are formal workers, how many are informal workers, how many are men, how many are women. Women, we could do to this level. We actually could not go to the aspect of household bargaining, etc. That kind of issue was not involved in this particular model. Is that okay?
Yes. Sure. Thanks a lot. Okay, so with this, if we don't have any questions and cognizant of the time, I would like to ask our speakers if they would like to have a 2 minutes closing remarks on the topic for today's session. And maybe we can start with Ulrike.
Well, what remains to be said? I think the Green Jobs Assessment is a necessity and also an asset to start or support any kind of sustainable strategy in a country. And if you are in the position of nudging either your governments or other stakeholders to have this kind of assessment, then I can only recommend it. And thanks for being here.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, same as Ulrich said, and in a way, this reports that you have come out with were made into some policy briefs, but I don't know how much it could be circulated or used as examples for other countries. Are we going in that direction or not? And are we going to, sort of look at all the models that has been developed through this framework and under your, particular umbrella, and how can we actually use these for good examples or whatever for other countries, and even for our countries. For example, this particular study has been given as a policy note, but don't think the government has really taken this up very seriously. So the ILO might want to be involved in a bigger way through GAIN. I don't know how GAIN and ILO is now, but somebody told me ILO is not really doing the GAIN thing, but there is a need actually to push for this. And the other thing was that, yes, we could think of expanding the data setup, which I always thought, as my recommendation also came up in my slides, that there is a need to collect more data, because if we don't have data, we do not have the instruments or the framework to even develop any model. So if there's a huge dearth of data in various countries, how do we nudge again the government to get this data? As you said, Massey had said we need to develop an environmental, social accounting framework. For that, national accounting framework. For that also, there's a need for getting such kind of data. Even for informal workers in India, is very dated data, and we try to get to this informal workers information through other kind of surveys and through various techniques, but there is no focus of getting data on such workers, at least in India as of now. So these are issues which, because of the employment issues involved in such questions, ILO in the countries and the regions might have another kind of way of handling this. That's one thing, and my request would be to get all the PPTs that were presented today. Of course, I have Ulrich's and Massey's, I think I haven't got. So if you could get the PPTs that were presented today, I think that's an easier task. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think your remarks are really relevant, and therefore I think this is a good place to end the third webinar of this GAIN webinar series. So we'll follow up shortly with the program of the 2019 webinar series, and we hope we'll meet again soon. So thank you very much to Massey, as I said before, and also of course to Ulrike and Sri, and also Fatma, who's here to help us with the technical issue. And finally, and most importantly, to our audience. So thank you very much to you all for being here, and I hope we'll meet again soon. So this being said, on behalf of the GAIN network, thank you for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.